You're listening to a new episode of the Brave Technologist, and this one features Debbie Reynolds, also known as the Data Diva. She's a globally recognized technologist, thought leader, and advisor in data privacy and emerging technology. With over 20 years of experience, she's delivered keynote talks for major organizations like TikTok, Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, PayPal, and Uber. Debbie hosts the #1 global award-winning podcast, The Data Diva Talks Privacy, and Identity Review has named her one of the top global 8 privacy experts. In this episode, we discussed how consumer expectations for data privacy are changing, new risks families should be aware of, especially parents with kids online, simple habits users can adopt to take back control of their privacy, and how companies can scale a human-centric approach to privacy. And now for this week's episode of The Brave Technologist. Debbie, welcome to The Brave Technologist. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Happy to be here and glad to chat with you again.
Yeah, likewise. I think let's kind of set the table for the listeners a bit. You've been in privacy for a long time. You want to give a little bit of background on what your current role is, what your area of focus is on the privacy space, and kind of how you got there, and made a career out of it.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's a big question. So I'm Debbie Reynolds. I'm the founder, CEO, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I work at the intersection of emerging technology and privacy. So I am a technologist by trade. I actually had a personal interest in privacy, personally, starting in around 1995. I read a book called The Right to Privacy. And at that point, I was shocked when I read this book. Caroline Kennedy was a co-author of this book, and it was about privacy in the U.S. And it was about the laws and the gaps in privacy back then. And remember, this was around the time when the commercial internet was brand new, and we didn't really know what data was going to be like on the internet. And I was shocked because I think in the U.S., we think we're the home of the free, the land of the brave, home of the free. And I just thought privacy was part of that. And because I found out that it wasn't, it's not part of the constitutional right, I was shocked. So as technology continued to evolve, and I'm a technologist, and I've worked a lot in digital transformation with a lot of big companies around multinational data transfers and stuff. And people who knew me from that work started to call me once the European Union started updating their privacy regime. So when they were trying to move towards the General Data Protection Regulation, one of the companies, the first big company to contact me was McDonald's Corporation, and they asked me to talk with them about privacy. And this is way before, the GDPR came out, and I was like, this is a big deal, and this is how it's going to impact everybody, not just people in Europe and stuff like that. And so, and then, over the years, as people learn more about it, I got contacted by PBS, and they asked me to be on there to talk about, why this is a big deal, why privacy is a big issue around in 2018. And so then I've been doing that. So I am a data privacy officer for many different companies. I do a lot of speaking and writing about privacy. I work with companies probably you've never heard of, like PayPal and Uber and Coca-Cola and TikTok.
Those little ones?
Yeah. Companies you've never heard of. So I also work on standards. So I run a group for IEEE. We are endeavoring to create a privacy labeling regime that is technology and legal agnostic.
Cool. Very cool. That's a great context too. I think, it must be just quite a journey going from looking at the privacy with the internet, back in the 90s to now. I mean, I was around when advertising went from, kind of a site by site thing with a cookie to programmatic. And that was such a huge shift. But from then to now, it's just crazy, right? And I think it kind of brings me to my next question too. I think big tech, they often promise convenience in exchange for data. How can everyday users spot when that trade-off starts to kind of tip against them?
I think it's hard. I think part of it is that companies are very good at making offers to people that are very enticing in the moment, and you don't really read the fine print and understand maybe down the line it's maybe not that big of a benefit to you. I think the relationship between consumers and these big companies are asymmetrical by nature, right? So they get more than what you get, than what you get back. But I think, especially in the internet age, is the asymmetry is astronomical at this point. So I think for people, they should think, for example, if they want to give their biometrics to Amazon for a $10 coupon, you're like, is that really worth it? Like, if my biometrics are breached, like, was it worth $10? So just thinking about that long term risk and not just the benefit of what you do, I think it will help consumers make better choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, do you see, I mean, you've got an interesting vantage point because you work both with companies and, and with the public. Are you seeing consumer expectations for data privacy changing? And, what role should companies like Brave and others play in that?
I'm definitely seeing a change. I think, especially around the time when the General Data Protection Regulation came out, I felt like I was like, like on a horse, like, oh, the British are coming, like trying to warn people. People weren't kind of listening. But now, because of all the things that we're seeing in the news around data breaches and things like that, I think I'm seeing consumers be holding their data closer to the vest, right? Not
Mhm.
giving it out to everybody and really thinking about it. And so I think that's probably the best first step. But I think what you all do in education and having people understand like what a internet experience or browser experience should be like is very important. So I actually tell you a really good story. I was recently on the internet. I was on a different browser and I was trying to read an article. You know how you get an article pops up. You're like, oh, let me see that. And so I went to this site, and it was so many. First of all, it was slow, and it was so many
Mhm.
ads on it that I couldn't like read the article. It's like you're trying to press buttons to like close things so that you can look at stuff. And I was like, that's it. So I like took that site and I actually opened up my Brave browser and I was like, oh, this is so much easier. It was faster. I didn't get all these crazy pop-ups. It was telling me, hey, this is how many things we blocked and different things like that. And so to me, it was just a better experience. And I've told a lot of people about it. So yeah, I mean, you all are doing a great job. I think I want to see a lot more people use that because I think people kind of default to what people typically use, and they don't really understand
Mhm.
that, you know, not in addition to it not being as fast as others, it's just very annoying. So I was pleased that
Right.
I could like read the article and not have to, swat these ads away like flies.
I know it's a really bad. I noticed too on the recipe sites where I just want to get to the ingredients and it's just like I can't get the ingredients to cook time. There's just like 50 other things in the way. Yeah, it's turned it into a bad game of annoyance. Like you framed up there. I think as AI is getting more advanced at profiling individuals and targeting them, et cetera. From your point of view, what risks should families be aware of, especially with parents with kids online?
That's a great question. Well, kids online, obviously, that's a very sensitive issue. I think it's very important for parents to know what kids are doing online. So, having conversations with them about what they're doing online, maybe even monitoring their phone, things like that. And that may seem kind of intrusive to kids, but I mean, think about, I'll give an example in the real world. So, let's say you have a kid, they have a friend that comes over that you don't know, and they decide, okay, well, I'm going to take this friend that you don't know up to my room. And you're like, what? Oh,
Mhm.
hell no, that's not going to happen, right? But that's what happens when kids are online, right? So they're
Mhm.
interacting with people you don't know. They're probably doing things that you don't know about. You don't know they're meeting up with people. So just understanding what kid is doing. And so, when I was growing up, we didn't have those issues. So I couldn't just have a friend or someone that my parents didn't know, like, burst into my house or whatever. And
Right.
so now I think in the internet age, because it's not that same physical thing where, the stranger's in the house because the stranger's on the phone or on the internet. I think parents really need to, be more connected with their kids and what they're doing online and making sure that they understand what those dangers are. 'Cause they don't really, they may think, oh, it's fun. They have all this freedom, but they may not know who they're talking to, whether it's a human, a
Mm-hmm.
person who's pretending to be maybe someone their age, maybe is older, maybe they're on with a bot or someone who's trying to manipulate them in some way. So I think it's just, it makes a parent's job or a guardian's job much harder than it was, I think, in
Mm-hmm.
my parents' day.
Yeah, and it is kind of a different balance too. I think because I feel this personally, as like a parent, right, with two young kids, that are under 10, and it's like I really care about privacy, of course, for myself and for my kids too. But at the same time, it's like you said, it's like a whole different level of stranger danger you're dealing with online, and sometimes even just a harmless query or something like that can take your kids to a very very dark place and not good. So it is a weird dynamic where you kind of have to be surveilling your kids, despite being very anti surveillance in a general kind of context. But there really aren't, I mean, a lot of safeguards out there, at least in the default modes with devices. And it's, how I haven't looked into these monitoring apps and things like that. Like, have you spent any time looking at those for parents to monitor their kids' devices and things like that? I'm just curious.
I haven't looked at them in a long time. I haven't heard of any. I know
Mm-hmm.
parents are still kind of struggling with that. I know that
Mm-hmm.
Apple has something that they put together for you to say, okay, I'm a parent and I'm the guardian of this person, and if we share this account, then I can give you updates and stuff. Most people don't do that. a lot of parental controls that are in place now. A lot of parents don't use them because it's just a lot of work. I think
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I actually had a friend. It's very interesting. So he decided for his family that the computers in the house had to be in the common areas of the house, so the kid couldn't have a phone or a computer upstairs. And at night, they had to give their phones to their dad or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's how he did
Yeah,
it. That was actually a good
yeah, yeah.
idea to make sure that because like, even when I was growing up, it makes me sound like I'm 100. That that we had one TV, and so my parents always knew what we
Yeah.
were watching because we were always watching the same thing. And so now we have people on tablets, on phones, on computers. They're at school, they're at home, they're away, and so there are just so many touch points or so many entry points for them to be able to interact. It's just hard to manage that flow of information.
Yeah, totally. And it feels like more and more all these other you almost have to assume every device connects to the internet now, which is kind of freaky in a different light. But I think that's a really good point that you bring up though, in your example there, where some of this is technological, right? Like whether it's a monitoring app, but a lot of this is also just practices, right? Like so, keeping the devices within eyes reach, and kind of limiting the space at home to certain areas or certain time frames. That's what we do. I mean, we're just pretty vigilant on not giving them too much time or making it more of a reward thing with a limited time span on it. But it is it seems like it's still very kind of wild west on that front, and not as well. I don't know. Maybe they're studying it, but it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like it's not seatbelt ready yet, like where, your cars are and things like that. But, kind of switching gears a little bit to, you're starting to hear a lot around like human centric approaches for privacy. I'm wondering if you might be able to shed a little light on what some of the key elements of human centric privacy approaches are and how can they be scaled across different industries.
Great question. Well, that's part of the work that I'm doing with IEEE. We're working on
Hmm.
next connectivity systems for human control and flow of data. And so
Hmm.
part of that human centricity is making sure that the human has more control of their data, as
Hmm.
opposed to, so like, for example, like the early internet, a lot of the ways that we interact with the internet are because back then, a lot of the computing, a lot of the power was at these big incumbents, right? And so, your phone wasn't very powerful back then. iPhones didn't exist back then and stuff. So now we have more power or computing on devices and stuff. So our devices may have enough power to do things that we don't necessarily have to do them like in the cloud, or we shouldn't have to share our credentials with everybody, right? So a lot
Hmm.
of that
Hmm.
is kind of sharing, trying to think about ways of sharing just in time, right? Where it's like you're not throwing a cauldron of your data into some big bucket that gets shared around with different people. You're more like, okay, I want to do this transaction, and then instead of me sharing everything, I just share what you need to know, right? And so
Yeah. Yeah.
so thinking about data in that way, and then also being able to take the data back, and that's been the hardest part, I think, around privacy, is that once you decide that you don't want to use a service, you don't want to do anything, these data systems are made to remember stuff and not to forget it, and that
Hmm.
is totally in opposition with what privacy should be, which is people should be able to choose, have agency. If they decide they don't want to use something or they want their data removed or something, they should be able to do that. And right now, the architectures are built in such a way that makes it like extremely hard to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think that people don't really grasp just how long the data collection has been going on for, right? Like where, it's 2025, like I mean programmatic advertising started scaling up what 2011, 2012, like people's data has been getting profiled for over a decade now, and it's a huge amount of information that these companies have. And I just remember from working in the space, like working in ad tech, like I couldn't tell you where the data ends up. It ends up, copy synced with a bunch of other stuff, with a bunch of other companies people haven't heard of. It's a really strong point, I think, that you bring up around being able to like have this ability to forget, who your data, like, and then how do you how is that from your point of view? You work with a lot of big companies on this, like I feel like it's almost like people are kind of questioning, or their trust in a lot of companies is kind of waning because of a lot of the breaches, and when they find out about how their data has been used and shared around, like it, I wonder with these things, like if people actually trust that their information is gone when they say it's gone, like what do you say to that? Like, I mean, you've worked with companies on this, like how are they thinking about this? And, are people, should people be concerned about that?
Yeah, I think people should be concerned. People should be concerned about that. I had an experience. I thought about this the other day where I previously lived in Washington D.C. and Washington D.C. they had a lot of CVS stores, right? So I moved
Hmm.
back to Chicago, and Chicago's more of like a Walgreens type of town, and so somehow I was in some other neighborhood and I ended up at a CVS. I hadn't been to a CVS in like 20 years. I walked in, they were like, "Oh, well, we have your account on file." I'm like, "From 20 years ago?" I'm like, "You still have that?" I'm like, "Oh my God." Right. And so it is concerning that a lot of companies don't delete your data or don't get rid of your data. So it just
Hmm.
makes the risk for you as a consumer and a company higher. So I think what companies are trying to figure out is how can they, you know, a lot of them are like super hot on personalization. So when you hear personalization, that just means they want more data about you, right? Because they want to like
Hmm.
tailor
Hmm.
experiences to you. But then how do they lower their risk and lower their breach risk for the individual by not keeping stuff too long? And so I think it's like a $1 trillion question that we have here. I think it's hard. It's being made harder with AI, where AI is more, not as transparent uh, as some other ways that companies have used data before, and so the things can really get out of control. But I think part of that is
Mhm.
not just looking at it in terms of, let's gather someone's data and then figure out what to do with it later. Some of it is like,
Mhm.
let's give less, ask less,
Yeah, yeah,
put
yeah.
less
No, I
stuff
think that's a great
in.
point.
And so
Yeah.
I think it's like a multi-pronged approach. So asking for less, like, for example, if someone wants to buy alcohol, like, do you need to know you scan their ID? I don't even know what's on your ID. We don't even know what information is tied to your ID, right? When they scan it, you don't know what they have, right?
Mhm.
But like, do they
Right.
need all that information, right? Like, you just need to know, am I over 18, right? Or if I'm over
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
21. And so part of
Yeah.
that is figuring out how to broker an answer to a question
Mhm.
without creating more risk for the individual. So almost like you
Yeah,
go
well,
to a bar, right? And you say, okay, you flash your ID and that's it. There's no data collected, right? It's that person saying, okay, I agree that you're over this age and we let you in. So thinking about it
mhm.
in a digital way, how can we do that in a digital sense where you're not creating more risk for the individual?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and it's almost like I mean, I remember incentives used to be so much towards collecting as much data as possible, to where you see like dark patterns and things like that, where people are kind of getting baited and switched into giving more and more of their information away without even knowing it. But now it seems like, and I'd love to hear your take on this. Like companies might be starting to see that collecting so much data is kind of becoming a liability. Do you feel that that's the case now? Has there been a shift there?
There has been a shift, and a lot of that is because of a lot of the data breaches that are happening. So, a lot of the data breaches, and I follow these very closely because I'm always interested in, like, how did they get breached or what got breached. And a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
data that gets breached are things that are typically like legacy data. So data that maybe is aged out. It doesn't have a super high business value, but it has a high cyber or privacy risk. And so
Mm-hmm.
having companies hold on to that data is just creating more risk for them and the individual. And so I think some companies are trying to wake up about that. So like maybe
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to get rid of old accounts. They're trying to get people, like limiting the time period of how long they keep data. And those are all good things. So I'm hoping companies do more of that.
Awesome, awesome. Every day too, people like we've been talking about are handing over more and more bits of their personal data. And you mentioned a couple of things here, but is there one simple habit that you would recommend that our users can adopt to take back their privacy or limit some of that, collection?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm gonna make a shameless plug here. It is true. So I use your browser even before we knew each other, and I really love it. And I
hmm
tell a lot of people about it. So just doing that, I think, will help people a lot because they don't know what sites that they're interacting with. They don't know the things they may be clicking on, maybe leading them down some path or, uh, you know, increasing their breach risk somehow. And so being able, and also certain states have laws or regulation around um, companies having to honor what's called a global privacy control, and we talked about this on my podcast too. So, the global privacy control is really a way for someone to be able to set their settings in a browser, and then when they go to websites, it's supposed to not ask them all these questions because that answer should be gotten in the browser. And so, not all companies are on board with that, but I feel like that will help consumers and like make their customer journey on certain websites a lot easier where they're not
hmm
always having to go to every site and say yes, no, accept, monitor, manage cookies and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. People are so blind to those cookie consents, like they just have kind of become another thing jumping out at them in the web page or whatever. Yeah, I think with AI kind of powering everything from recommendations to surveillance, like what top privacy and governance challenges lie ahead from your point of view, and how do you recommend companies prepare for that?
I think some of the top privacy challenges that companies they think about is transparency. Transparency number one. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
lot of data uses that companies had in the past, they did not have to be transparent. And so I think in the internet age, especially, is making it. The AI age is making it even that much harder, right? Where a lot of companies don't know where they already don't know where data goes once it goes into the organization, right? It's duplicated, it's split up, it's put into different places, and so now you're creating more complexity when you're bringing in AI. And so the challenge for them was to be able to still be find a way to be transparent about how they're using people's data and think about it not just from a collection point of view, but all the way through the data life cycle. So data has a life cycle from cradle to grave. So there should be an end of life for data. And so a lot of that plays into privacy, where if you're keeping data too long, you're creating more risk for you and for the user. And so I think companies are trying to, especially with AI now, they have to think more holistically around that data lifecycle, because a lot of the problems that we see companies have are in those maybe secondary data uses, like maybe someone, let's say data. Oh, this is a good example. So Twitter many years ago had a situation where they had decided they wanted to have people use multi-factor authentication, and they wanted them to opt into that. So some people opted into it, and so in order to do that, they need to collect more information. So the people did that. Some people agreed to do that, and so that was fine, right? So that's what we call data provenance, where you give someone data, they have the right to use it, right? Because you agreed to it or they're doing some type of service for you. But then somehow the marketing people got their paws on the data and they start using it for advertising, right? And so that was bad,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they
Mm-hmm.
didn't
Mm-hmm.
ask the people, that was not the initial intended purpose for the data. And so they got in trouble for that. But I think a lot of that happens because when you have data too long or you don't understand where it comes from or understand that lineage of data, it's easy for companies to run afoul. Like I said, they kind of run off the railroad tracks at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So the majority, I think a lot of companies, unfortunately, right now are very concerned about the provenance part, kind of like the collection part at the front end. They aren't as concerned, aren't looking very much at the lineage part, and that's mostly where companies fall short on the privacy end of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing some concerns around kind of even company data. When people are putting things into models and I mean into these bots and into these chat prompts and things like that, and making sure that you're not like leaking company data and information like that. No, it's interesting. Looking ahead 5 years down the road, where do you see the biggest battleground between privacy and emerging technology taking place?
Great question. Well, I think the biggest battleground between privacy and the future will be around decentralization of data.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there will be, so right now, let's say we want to log into a particular thing. So we'll say we have Google. So we go in, we log into Google, maybe we use 10 or 12 different services. So that data is shared, with all those services. I think in the future, people, maybe on their devices will be almost like a bank of their own
Mm-hmm.
information, and that they're only sharing what they need to do a certain transaction. So it's not as
Mm-hmm.
though they're going to the mothership and the mothership has all their information, right? And they're kind of logging in. I think in the future, people on their devices will have a way where they're brokering information, right? Where in this example where I say, okay, let's say you want to buy alcohol. So you don't need to know my name. You don't need to know where I live. You need to know, am I over 21?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
so I think in the future there's going to have to be some type of intermediary where, and I hope it's decentralized in a way where people don't have to share everything to answer one thing or two things. So that's what I think is going to be the biggest battle, because what that will mean is that a lot of that power will shift more to the individual, away from kind of these bigger services. And so I think that's actively happening already, where, a lot of these companies, they want you to be on a more central service, but the technology has advanced to a point where the type of decentralization I'm talking about is possible. So we'll see how that works.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, and we're starting to see, we've seen cases, here and there where it seems kind of siloed in a way where look, oh, my YouTube channel was taken down. Now I have no way of making money anymore because I had invested all of my effort into this platform or this service. Or I think I was seeing something where somebody got what was it, a false positive flagged for something, were locked out of their Google account, and all their photos of their kids and everything were all stored in the cloud. They couldn't access those memories anymore. And so I think you've got a great point there, because it also seems like we're getting into a time where regulators and lawmakers are kind of realizing they've got to start to look at things a little bit differently. And, me personally, the more they try to regulate these things, they just end up collecting more data and then missing the ball anyway, so it seems like, having things, technology will need to, do a lot of the lifting there on it. But I couldn't agree more on the decentralization part, because, it's really how you could have control over it. So I think that's a great point. Well, Debbie, you've been super gracious with your time and covered a lot of ground here. If people want to follow you, you got your podcast. Where can they take a look and see where you're posting online?
Sure. Well, I'm always on LinkedIn, so you can type in Data Diva, Debbie Reynolds, and my name will pop right up. I also have a website, DebbieReynoldsConsulting.com. I have a lot of my articles and videos and things there. And then I have a podcast. So it's the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast. It's the number one data privacy podcast in the world for 5 years. We have listeners in over 123 countries.
Awesome. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for coming on today. I'd love to check back in later and see how things are going too. And really, really appreciate you making the time.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Brave Technologist podcast. To never miss an episode, make sure you hit follow in your podcast app. If you haven't already made the switch to the Brave browser, you can download it for free today at brave.com. and start using Brave Search, which enables you to search the web privately. Brave also shields you from the ads, trackers, and other creepy stuff following you across the web.